Brexit. The word itself has dominated British political discourse for nearly a decade. Everyone was promised that once it was delivered, the UK would take back control of its laws, borders and trade. Yet, years after the 2016 Brexit referendum, the British government has struggled to fully implement the consequences of that decision. And today we'll dive into the repeated delays, complications, and the most recent news, the postponement yet again of post-Brexit checks on imported fruit and vegetables. When the Leave campaign won the 2016 referendum, there was a simple vision sold to the British people. Reclaiming control of their laws, borders and trade. And at the heart of it was the idea that Britain could leave the European Union, negotiate its own trade deals, and ensure that EU standards and regulations no longer dictated life in the UK. This was meant to be a bold, independent future for the nation, one that would break free from Brussels' grip. Yet the actual delivery of Brexit has been far more complicated. Despite leaving the EU on January 31st in 2020, the UK has faced multiple hurdles in fully enacting its post-Brexit policies. These challenges have been particularly visible in trade, where regulatory frameworks and border checks, especially on food, have become a major sticking point. A key promise of Brexit was that the UK would regain full control over its borders, meaning it would implement its own checks on goods coming into the country. In theory, this was to ensure that Britain maintained food standards, security and regulatory compliance. But the governments have struggled to put this into practice. Originally, checks on goods from the EU were supposed to start soon after Brexit became official. However, the deadlines for implementing full customs checks and sanitary and phytosanitary controls, essentially checks on food and agricultural products, have been delayed multiple times. First in 2021, then 2022, and again throughout 2023. On September 13th in 2024 now, it was announced that these checks on fruit and vegetables would be delayed yet again. The government has now pushed back the introduction of these controls until January 2025, citing concerns about the impact on inflation, food prices, and the ongoing cost of living crisis. While it's understandable that ministers are concerned about consumer costs, this raises serious questions about whether the UK will ever be able to fully enforce the Brexit vision it promised. So why is the government struggling to implement these checks? Several factors come into play here. First, there's the issue of preparedness. Despite the years of planning, it seems that both the governments, and the private sector were not fully ready for the complexities of post-Brexit trade. Setting up the infrastructure for border checks, hiring enough customs officials, and ensuring ports were capable of handling these new procedures turned out to be far more complicated than initially thought. And second, there's the issue of supply chains. The UK imports a significant proportion of its fresh fruit and vegetables from the EU, particularly Spain and the Netherlands. And these goods are perishable, and any delays at the border could lead to spoilage, shortages and price hikes. For a government already dealing with still higher inflation than they want and the results of the cost of living crisis, adding more strain to food supplies is politically risky. Third, there's a deeper economic concern. Brexit has already caused disruptions to trade, with many businesses reporting increased costs and administrative burdens. Imposing these checks could exacerbate those problems, making imports even more expensive and less competitive, something even the new government is keen to avoid. The continuous delays in implementing these border controls fully aren't just administrative inconveniences, they have real-world consequences. First, the failure to enforce these checks means the UK isn't fully in control of its own borders, which was a central argument for leaving the EU. Goods coming in from the continent are essentially entering the UK under EU rules, meaning British standards are still not entirely separate from EU standards. And this raises questions about sovereignty and the long-term vision for an independent Britain. Second, these delays are creating an uncertain business environment. UK businesses that rely on EU imports or export goods to Europe are stuck in limbo, unsure of when new regulations will hit or what the final trade landscape will look like in the end. Many businesses have already reported increased red tape, and further delays just add to the confusion and planning difficulties they face. And third, politically, this puts now even the Labour government in a difficult position. The Conservatives have repeatedly promised to deliver on the benefits of Brexit, but every delay makes it seem like the UK is incapable or unwilling to see it through. This already alienated Conservative voters, especially those who were enthusiastic about leaving the EU. And other people are now skeptic even about Labour, because they always warned about the complexity of post-Brexit trade. We also can't talk about the complications of implementing Brexit without mentioning Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol, which was designed to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, has created a unique situation where goods moving between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK face different regulatory checks. And this has led to political tension, with unionists arguing that Northern Ireland is effectively being treated differently from the rest of the UK, while the EU insists on maintaining the integrity of the single market, of course. The former government's difficulty in balancing the sensitive issue with the rest of its Brexit promises only added to the broader picture of a Brexit that is far from fully realized. And now even the new government delays this and is struggling to fully implement Brexit, even if they say they will not reverse it. And this will also have significant implications for Britain's international standing. The delays send a message to the world that the UK is struggling to manage its post-Brexit future. At a time when the UK is trying to negotiate new trade deals with countries outside the EU, like the US, Australia and others, the image of an indecisive and disorganized government could harm its bargaining position. They did it with Australia, but India and the US are still far on the horizon. If Britain can't manage its own borders, why would potential trade partners take them seriously? Moreover, there is a reputational risk to Britain's reliability as a trading partner. Constant changes and delays in import regulations make it harder for international suppliers to plan effectively, which could discourage them from doing business with the UK altogether. So, where does this leave us? The Labour government has now set a new deadline for implementing the full checks, targeting January 2025. But will this deadline finally be met? Well, that's hard to say. One possibility is that as January approaches, the government might find itself under even more pressure from businesses, supply chains and consumers to delay further. Alternatively, if these checks are finally enforced, we could see immediate impacts on food prices and availability, something that will be closely watched, especially given the current state of the economy. The bigger question, though, is what this means for the broader Brexit project. The inability to fully implement Brexit, particularly around trade and border controls, reflects the complexities and contradictions that many experts warned about before the referendum. As time goes on, the gap between the promises of Brexit and its practical realities seem to be widening. Brexit was meant to be a decisive moment in British history, a turning point that would redefine the nation's relationship with the world. Yet, years after the vote, it remains a project mired in delays, complications and compromises. And last week's news about the further postponement of border checks on fruit and vegetables is just the latest example of how Brexit in practice is proving far more challenging than its architects anticipated. And as we look ahead, even the new government faces tough decisions. Will they finally implement the full range of post-Brexit policies, or will delays continue? And what will the long-term consequences be for the British economy, but also its place in the world and the legacy of Brexit itself? Only time will tell. But if you want to see another video, the next one is right here in the end screen.